request.
There you go. Okay. Uh, we're going to begin tonight with a presentation by Jonathan Cohn. Jonathan is the policy director of Progressive Mass, a statewide member-based grassroots advocacy group fighting for a more just, equitable, sustainable, and democratic Massachusetts. He represents the organization in statewide coalitions on economic fairness, immigrants' rights, criminal legal reform, housing justice, education, voting rights, and more. And he puts together Progressive Mass's annual scorecard of the state legislature, which many of us use. He has worked in professional or volunteer capacities for progressive campaigns at the city, state, and federal levels for 13 years. He hails from Philadelphia, but moved to Boston in 2013. And as he likes to say, he was already knocking on doors on his third weekend here. Welcome, Jonathan.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm looking forward to this discussion tonight about an important topic here in Massachusetts of how we can make our legislature do what we often already think Massachusetts should have done and done years ago. Uh, so you can go on to the next slide. So I wanted to orient our discussion here with like where are we in the legislative timeline right now, right? If we're talking about the legislature, it's just good to ground us in that. And so if we're thinking about that next week, we'll have the last day for recorded votes in 2025, right? The session started in January. It'll largely finish up next July, but can go all the way to the end of the year. But they're gonna break for Thanksgiving, and they're not gonna do much work in December. That the last day for hearings will likely be Tuesday, December 2nd, because the last day for committees to take action is going to be December 3rd, even though they will likely give themselves extensions and extensions and extensions, rather than treat that as a hard deadline, something that I think speaks to some of the discussions we'll have later this evening. But so what's happened in 2025? Not a lot. So as of a few days ago, when I put the slide together, there were only 55 bills signed into law. Almost half of those were home rule petitions for one city or town. 14 were personnel matters for one person. 8 were budgets or supplemental budgets that they legally had to pass. 2 were awareness days for a specific disease. 2 were bond authorizations, and that left only 3 other pieces of legislation. One of them was temporarily extending hybrid meeting access, which they refused to make permanent. One was a terrible decision to make September 1st the primary date next year, the big moving day for renter-heavy areas of the state, as well as before Labor Day. And one good substantive piece of standalone legislation of updating our shared law of protecting kind of access to abortion care and gender affirming care, which was like, again, the one standalone as opposed to rolled into other things piece of legislation that followed a process and got passed this year. And that this kind of speaks to why are we having this discussion, right? Next slide. So one thing, and I'll use this as a framing device in my discussion, and it flows really well into kind of John Heck's as well, is what I call the two bosses problem of the Massachusetts State House. For most of us, if you have the person who can hire and fire you and the person who controls your pay are the same person, and you call that person your boss. However, in the legislature, there's a disconnect, right? We have boss number one, the constituents who decide whether or not you keep your job when you're put up for a vote in elections, as well as you have boss number two, the House and Senate leadership who decide your pay. And if boss number one doesn't exert power, that means that you have an kind of an insularity to the state house and the ascendance of boss number two. The rest of my presentation will talk a little bit more about the struggles to assert the power of boss number one, and I think like kind of former Representative Hecht will talk about how we can weaken the power of outsized power of boss number two. But next slide. So again, bringing us the context of where we are. So Massachusetts has the third largest Democratic supermajority in the country, right? When we're thinking about how much more we could be doing, know that we have the larger Democratic supermajority than other state that has a supermajority, except for Hawaii and Rhode Island, with like over 80% Democrats in both chambers. And we have had a supermajority for 40, like we have had this for 40 years. Although you get the kind of the downside of our kind of one party state is that there's only one party to buy, not for big interests. And so you get that negative effects of the concentration of power there due to lack of competition. Would I take that over being in a one party like Republican state? Hands down, but there are real negative effects from this that we can work to counteract, and which we'll be talking about today. Next slide. So, and with this, so one thing that's always an annoyance with the way our legislature works is that because of that one party dimension in the legislature, you have the Democratic Party in Massachusetts viewing itself as the arbiter of disagreement between capital and labor. Right? We would like to believe that the Democratic Party would be a robust, fighting left labor coalition party, right? As is how the kind of the activist base of the party wants it to be and has the politics of. But so often the state house ends up viewing itself as in the middle with labor on one side and have the kind of corporate lobby on the other, and they're just here to negotiate between. Kind of next slide. Because of that, you often see like one step forward, maybe partial step back, where whenever we're able to make gains, the legislature also wants to give some goodies over to the richest members of the Commonwealth and the corporate lobby at the same time. We saw that in 2002 when we were able to kind of in the midst of kind of a recession then saw like a raise on tax on capital gains, but also kind of regressive taxes as well because of quote everybody needing to share the burden, right? Even though the burden doesn't fall equally on everybody in a recession. In 2007, the legislature closed tax loopholes, but also wanted to cut the corporate tax rate at the same time, right? Heaven forbid we make the corporations pay their fair share. In 2018, when you had the grand bargain that folks might remember of where they kind of legislature kind of negotiated to knock off several ballot questions. We were able to win a $15 minimum wage, but the legislature ended Sunday and kind of holiday kind of premium pay at the same time to give something to the retailers. And we saw this more recently with like we had a big win back in 2022 by passing the Fair Share Amendment, right? Often known as the millionaire's tax, where we broke kind of the longstanding prohibition of progressive taxation in the state. And after we won that, the legislature voted to cut taxes in a fairly regressive tax package, which did things like rolling back the estate tax and rolling back the capital gains tax. However, like despite it viewing this as like do one for one side and the part for the other, the reality of the past like several decades in Massachusetts has been growing inequality, right? We can make some dents, but we really, if you look at, and if you can go to the next slide, where you can see that widening gap, where wages really are not catching up to where they need to be, and at the same time, the corporate profits in our state is rising. And so, if we want an economy that works for everyone, that has to be an economy that is fundamentally different from the one that we have now, with real policy attention. Next slide. So how do we get that? There have been two, if you go to the past few decades, have been two major attempts to break through that status quo of the legislature. And I'll talk about kind of each of them. The latter one I know of firsthand. The first one I know of from others. The first one was back in like the late 90s through the 2000s was the Working Family Agenda kind of effort, and then more recently that folks might be familiar with, kind of the Raise Up Mass Coalition. And I'll talk about each in turn. Next slide. So with the working family kind of agenda, and that was kind of a coalition considering of many of the partners one would expect that would have folks like the SEIUs, the teachers, and kind of progressive community groups like the Coalition for Social Justice, Neighbor to Neighbor, etc., kind of behind it, had a strategic goal of building kind of a working family agenda majority in the legislature through mobilizing in key working class districts across the state. Next slide. They did. I love seeing a legislator rating thing as somebody who has noted does their scorecard with Progressive Mass. that they put together kind of a rating for each legislator based on their votes on issues like good paying jobs, education, affordable healthcare, childcare, housing, kind of a strong safety net, and kind of use that to rate like, okay, how do these who are our champions and who are really our kind of our opponents on this to get a sense of that spread in the legislature. Next slide. That with that, at the same time that they evaluated the legislators, they also looked at the districts to see like kind of looking at the districts in terms of their income levels, right? The percentage of people who are under the poverty line, looking at the demographics of the districts to see what are districts with large kind of Black and Latino populations, to see where is there a real gap between the legislators and the people that they represent, and a gap that needs to be closed. That I would say like this is the comment I see in the chat. Fully acknowledge it's not just that people at work. Some of that gets to the people living on. Some of that gets to the issues around the poverty line, where you can see like including as a metric there. And some of the deeper questions are above my pay grade. But as somebody who came was too young when that was happening, but it's a good point to acknowledge. They would use that information to create a list of targeted districts each cycle, seeing about kind of again looking at that gap for which districts have a lot of potential to elect champions for a working family agenda, but lack legislators who really meet that, and then focus on organizing in those districts to set up coalitions based on who had a base in that district to then engage that base, both members of organizations and and those who are outside of organizations through key work on the ground. Okay, thanks. They'd also work together to put together kind of a formal agenda, surveying affected communities and the different member organizations, allied legislators, evaluating campaigns on issues of like breadth, significance, and viability. So breadth, what is the reach of this policy? Significance, how much of a difference does it make for people if we pass this? And viability, can we win? Would survey kind of survey folks via an e-ballot, and then have a kind of a Congress at the State House to select priorities kind of in the beginning of the legislative session. Okay. Uh, and what are the tactics to win, right? So they're focused on both legislative accountability and electoral accountability. With legislative accountability, that included things that we know well, like state house lobbying, doing in-district meetings and target districts so that legislators have to face their constituents, right, in person and hear from them directly in the community. Kind of broader accountability sessions with kind of local legislative delegations in like the big cities like a Worcester, Springfield, etc., as well as electoral accountability, right? Because people need to know that the way to flex power is to show that people can lose their seat, or some people can win their seat on agenda or lose their seat for being an opponent, and kind of use that as a metric for where to challenge people and which people to field or back in open seats that can be prime pickup opportunities. Next slide. So during this period, there were some major accomplishments. That was when we saw the minimum wage raised from $5.25 an hour to $8 an hour. The coalition was able to get increased childcare funding, raising the tax on long-term capital gains and raising $1 billion a year in new revenue, and expanding mass health benefits in our healthcare reform law that became a model for what was done nationally, as well as had electoral wins of increasing the number of reps with kind of a higher rating from 35 to 65, so almost doubling and inching near the majority, which would be 81. They unseated some kind of long time serving uh, incumbents who are in leadership, which can send a message. If you know that somebody lost their seat because of their opposition to a specific policy, it helps build the political capital to move that policy forward and set the narrative of that race itself. As well as they were able to build the power to move some like specific delegations, like Worcester, which had a notoriously conservative legislative delegation, kind of move them much like a significant progressive shift in Worcester. But as you might know, we don't hear about the working family agenda today. So what happened, right? That there are a few different things that people involved in that speak as some of the downfall of that as a constellation in the state. One, and I feel like many of us suffer from this problem as well. Okay, the breadth of the agenda can make it difficult to maintain unified action. When you want to do everything, it can sometimes make it difficult to focus and apply pressure in the way that we need to. I know that well. Although beyond that, from the campaign, you also saw House leadership learn, right? If you're doing a campaign against to put pressure on the state house also evolves and adapts and can then figure out how to work around that pressure. And that happened in key ways, many of which we still know very clearly today, in the landscape under which we organize. One of them was putting some of the key champions of that kind of working family agenda into leadership positions that make them become much more insular to the state house. Because if you then get higher pay in your chairmanship and are given and are kind of spoken to as though you have an influence in the process, you then suddenly stop playing an inside-outside game with the folks on the outside and start viewing things only internally to the building and want to protect your access to leadership and get very hesitant about any efforts to shake things up. And at the same time as you can kind of give people carrots to get them to not want to do as much organizing internally or kind of collaboration with those organizing externally, you can send anybody who votes off into the basement. So you have the stick and the carrot to get people to fall and kind of largely fall in line. We also saw kind of an evolution to kind of what are called omnibus bills. That's when, if that's not a familiar term, that's when you take everything and shove it into one giant bill. If you're familiar with how our legislature often does policy through the budget, that speaks to this. But it's often let's not vote on standalone bills themselves. Let's throw everything into one giant package so that everybody can see at least one thing that they like, and even if they hate a lot of it, they'll still vote for it because of the one thing that they like, and it makes the ability to message it more difficult, and it makes the ability to do accountability more difficult because it's not just a vote on one thing. It's a vote on all of these different things, some of them which may be good and some of which might be dumpster fires. And these dynamics kind of weakened that kind of relationship between the kind of those inside and those outside, as well as we saw some right-wing ballot initiatives really kind of harm the past wins. So where we are now, many of you might be familiar with Raise Up Mass, which is in many ways a successor to that work. When Raise Up decided, having seen a lot of right-wing actors win via ballot initiatives and seeing so many things like die in the legislature, decided to have a different strategy around how to win policies to reduce inequality and kind of increase economic fairness in the Commonwealth. And that was specifically using ballot initiatives to put, because if you're planning to go to the ballot, you can either say the legislature, you negotiate with us, or we're taking it straight to the people. So that you can either win it by the legislature or you can win at the polls. This, when Raise Up came about, right, in the early 2010s, was also a time when it was able to speak to things popular in, like, say, the discursive space, right? When that was the big time following Occupy of language like kind of the 99% versus the 1%, and where issues around how high inequality had gotten in the US really did have national attention, as well as campaigns with national headwinds like the Fight for 15 that were existing across states, so that you were part of a larger effort, not just one here, that had messaging that resonated across. Also, part of that strategy was just to choose just 1 to 3 priorities that, again, would be broad, significant, and viable, and to be a coalition of faith, labor, and community groups. I see kind of questions that, again, that's because you do have a number of groups that do a lot of good progressive organizing in faith communities. Check them, community groups, because you'd have like faith groups, which would be like, let's say, like the Jewish Alliance for Law and Social Action, MCAN, being another good example of them. There are also groups like ECHO that do a lot of great work in that kind of faith organizing space. Community groups, Progressive Mass, kind of the Massachusetts Voter Table, Progressive Dems of Mass, the List Coalition for Social Justice, and Labor, to be able to have that as like a clear coalition that also helps with the messaging of who's being unified around a campaign. With this effort, Uh, just to do fun, who here has ever done signature collection for any of the Raise Up campaigns? Whether that was Earn Sick Time back in 2014, the minimum wage camp and paid family medical leave campaigns for 2018, or the Fair Share Amendment, with signature collection starting back in 2015, right? So one thing that Raise Up was able to do, and those of you raising your hands are a demonstration of why it was able to happen, is that Raise Up became the first kind of coalition that was able to do an all grassroots signature collection model. That so many of this isn't a knock on organizations. Most people will do paid signature collection to get a question on the ballot. It's a lot of work, and it's easier. It's often easier to raise the money to organize the volunteer infrastructure. But Raise Up was able to pioneer an all grassroots one, working through the membership of the organizations in the coalition, with kind of live data about kind of how the campaign was doing. And Raise Up was also able to have real wins, like winning an increase of the minimum wage to $11 in 2014. There was universal earned sick time. People remember that was question four on the 2014 ballot. On 2018, we won the $15 minimum wage, as well as kind of a paid family and medical leave. It always feels great hearing people talk about the benefits of paid family medical leave that they were able to experience, since it's kind of still appalling that it took us so long to get that. You can click next, 'cause I think the next one's going to be about fair share. That although the campaign took longer than it should have, we were able to break the over a century long prohibition on progressive taxation by passing the Fair Share Amendment, with that tax on income over $1 million, that has raised more money than expected, or some of the early projections, and created real significant investments in public education and transportation in the state, delivering things like free community college, universal school meals, fare-free regional transit authorities, and so much more. Uh, However, we're now at the period of time where some of those same strategies might not continue, to be able to deliver in the way that they once were, which are kind of the basis for this discussion of what we can we do to kind of reinvigorate that kind of grassroots, that kind of left labor coalition in Massachusetts. That legislative leadership can eventually start realizing they can just ignore ballot threats and tell people we don't need to do anything, just go to the ballot if you want to. And also that they don't feel the need to pay attention to ballot question results as much. I think that's something that we're seeing now with the results of the audit ballot question, where the legislature just decided that they didn't need to pay attention to it, and are fighting that, and that which is a real threat to the ability to win at the ballot, where they don't feel as wedded to what the people say. It's also a lot of the kind of general milieu around the 2010s, with a lot of national discussion around inequality as a major issue, is just less salient. That's like you hit waves when it comes to what issues we're all talking about at the same time. And that it is always interesting to reflect back on, because whatever campaign you're working on, sometimes you can be lucky and you can have that campaign hit at a time when it's what everybody's talking about. And you're not part of like the same national movement across many states, and knowing that people often get their news national boomeranging back, there's a kind of a weakening that comes from that. We also see that the fact that we're under an all-out kind of right-wing assault from the Trump administration in DC, a never-ending string of chaos, cruelty, and corruption, where we're going to be seeing steep budget cuts, next year, without other action from the legislature due to the kind of big ugly bill passed by Republicans over the summer, where we see cuts to mass health, SNAP, education, and so much more, with the legislature not acting. And at the same time, we've seen an emboldening of kind of the corporate lobby in Massachusetts, where after they were salting for kind of because of losing against the Fair Share Amendment, have been trying to assert their power more, and have a governor and a legislature who too often listens to them and associates bowing to their demands with success. And I think that might be, yes, you can hand it over to that. So that kind of sets the stage for knowing that. I think my last slide might actually, is it still after his? I think I had one more slide, but I can, okay, I'll hand it over. Basically, my final thing here, and I'll hand it over. to kind of former Representative Hecht, is knowing where we are now. The great discussions that we need to be having is how do we reinvigorate that left labor coalition and think about how are we applying legislative pressure and how are we applying electoral pressure in a way that really can be felt by legislatures and overtake the headwinds of opposition that we're facing now. But I'll pass over the mic.
Henry, do you want me to just jump in or?
No, I have to take myself off mute. So thank you, Jonathan. That was really informative. We're going to have time for discussion in a few minutes. If you don't mind, put your questions into the chat and we'll take those we can. Our next talk is going to be by Jonathan Hecht, who can give you the view from inside because Jonathan served as state representative for Watertown and Cambridge from 2009 through 2021. He served on several legislative committees, including transportation, global warming and climate change, public health, elder affairs, children, families, and persons with disabilities, healthcare, finance, and election laws. Earlier in his career, he worked internationally on legal reform and human rights with a focus on China. He also served as the Watertown Town Councilor from 2006 to 2009. Currently, he is a member of the steering committee of the Coalition to Reform Our Legislature and is one of the principal authors of the coalition's white paper, Democracy in Decline, and part of the working group that developed bills and a ballot question to make the Massachusetts legislature more democratic, transparent, responsive, and effective. Jonathan, welcome.
Thank you very much, Henry. Thanks to you and Martha and all the people who have organized this forum. Thanks, John, for that amazing presentation. It's great to be with everybody to talk about this issue, which has been on my mind for many years. I actually want to start by going back, if we can go back one slide, there we go, to this slide that was in John's presentation about how DeMacy and DeLeo did in the working family agenda. But actually, even before that, I just want to say a very quick word about legislative dysfunction. And what do we mean by legislative dysfunction? Because there are many ways in which our legislature is dysfunctional. It's unresponsive, it's unproductive, it's untransparent. But the thing that I want to emphasize is that all of these stem from a more fundamental dysfunction. And that's the failure of the legislature to function as a representative democracy. So here in this slide, John pointed to two main ways that DeMacy and DeLeo undermine the working family agenda. So first of all, again, go back up. Sorry. So you see it over there on the green side, the top ones there. So the first thing they did, was to use their power as speaker to appoint key members of the working family agenda and to that coalition in the House to chairmanships or conversely send them to the basement. So in other words, they exercise their control by giving or withholding the status and even more importantly, the additional pay, what we call stipends, that comes with appointments to leadership or committee positions. So this induced or forced legislators to bend to the leader's agenda, as defined by him and those who have influence with him. So that was the first way that they went after the working family agenda. The second thing they did was they undermined the agenda by bundling bills into these large omnibus bills that John was talking about to reduce the number of recorded roll call votes. And this weakened one of the main mechanisms by which voters hold elected representatives accountable. So, in the absence of public debate, in the absence of public votes, holding legislators accountable becomes much harder. So the next slide. So just to sum that up, again, the double whammy: assert top-down control by allocating financial rewards, undermine the bottom-up accountability by reducing both the opportunity and, I would say, the obligation of legislators to take a public position on many issues. So we have a chance today, I'm going to talk later, to push back on these twin threats. That's the goal of the stipend reform ballot question, to push back on these two ways in which representative democracy has been undermined in the Massachusetts legislature. But first, I want to show you how each of these two problems has become even worse in recent years. So this slide shows the percentage of House Democrats, Democratic members of the House, who are getting stipends. It shows it over the course of several decades. If you look at 2005, that's the beginning of Sal DeMacy's time as Speaker, there were 50 stipends for Democratic members of the House. And you can see that was under 40%, about 37%, 36, 37% of House Democrats at that time. If you go now all the way to the end, where we are now, it's the same number in 2025 there. There are now 94 stipends for Democratic members of the House. And that's over 70% of House members who are receiving a portion of their pay directly from the Speaker. And if Speaker DeMacy could derail the working family agenda by strategically allocating 50 stipends, think about how much easier it is now for Speaker Mariano to exert control by allocating 94 stipends. And it's important to note, if you want to go to the next slide, that 94 Democrats is not just 70% of that party's members, of the Democratic members of the House. It's actually a majority. 94 is a majority of the entire 160-member House. And this quote from my former colleague and very close and dear friend, Denise Provo, really sums up the significance of that. There used to be a system in the House that when a bill was coming up, you would get polled by a member of leadership to see where you stood on the bill, see what your thoughts were, and ultimately ask you how you were going to vote. When the number of stipended members exceeded a majority, exceeded 81, got to 94, the polling stopped. So it's also important to look at what's happened to the size of the stipends. That is, to understand what's at stake financially in getting or not getting a stipend. And here too, there's been a very big change over the last 20 years. On the left there, you got the 50 stipends that were for House Democrats in 2005. And you can see that the ones in red, the 17 highest stipends, only those 17 added 25% or more to the base pay. The base pay at that time, $55,569. A stipend of $15,000 or more added 25% to your pay. So that was in 2005. If you look over on the right-hand side to 2025, now the base pay has gone up because there's an indexing factor that increases generally the size of the base pay. Of the 94 stipends that are now available for the Speaker to hand out to House Democrats, 67 of them add 25% or more to base pay. So $22,000 or higher, those stipends are now what the Speaker can use to add 25% or more to the base pay. So the next slide, I just want to make clear that this is not just a House problem. It's a bigger problem in the House, but it's not just a House problem. The trend toward top-down control over a growing share of legislators' pay is also present in the Senate. Unlike in the House, where even today you've got haves and have-nots, there are still today, I think it's 39 House Democrats who receive no stipend at all, only the base pay. For a long time in the Senate, all of the Democratic senators have received a stipend. And this made differences of pay in the Senate smaller than in the House. But as you can see here, in recent years, the growth in the number of stipends, and now all Democratic senators receive 2 stipends. And even more importantly, the growth in the size of the stipends has created much greater pay inequity. You see a much greater range of total pay. This is showing total pay, that base pay plus the stipends. And you can see how we've now got a pay structure that's much, much more stratified and inequitable in the Senate. And that, creates more incentive, for senators to tend to their relationship with leaders. So next slide. I want to turn now to the second part of the double whammy, and that's the lack of bottom-up accountability. And we talked about how House leaders, their tactic of using the omnibus bills to reduce the number of meaningful roll calls, how that played a role in undermining the working family agenda. That trend has continued. The number of recorded roll call votes on the floor of the House in the last 2-year session, I'm indebted to John for bringing this to my attention, that number was the lowest it's ever been. It was actually half of the average number over the prior 20 years. So that trend has continued. But I want to here draw your attention to another development that I think has been even more significant in weakening the bottom-up accountability over the last 20 years. And that's the disappearance of any meaningful role for most of our elected representatives in the legislative committees. Committees are the workhorses of the lawmaking process. That's where the in-depth, detailed work of reviewing bills, amending them, deciding which should go forward, which should not, that's where that typically takes place. And in Massachusetts, we have joint committees made up of both senators and representatives. There are currently 31 of them. And all bills are assigned to one of the joint committees, and they all receive a public hearing. And I imagine many of you have attended some of those public hearings. The question is, what happens after that, after the public hearing? And you can see this is a quote that I pulled from a little pamphlet that Secretary Galvin has put together. You can get it at the State House. It describes the lawmaking process in Massachusetts. And here he describes what's supposed to happen. You can see, so the first, down in the second paragraph there, the Joint Standing Committee schedule the public hearings, offers an opportunity for citizens, legislators, lobbyists to express their views. The next sentence, committee members meet at a later time in executive session to review the public testimony and discuss the merits of each bill before making their recommendations to the full membership of the House. That's what is supposed to happen. And note there, and this again is from the Secretary's pamphlet, executive session is not a private. In most legislatures, we call it a markup session. The public doesn't participate in the executive session, the markup session, but it may observe them. These are supposed to be all open to the public. That was a big reform, actually, that happened in Massachusetts in the early 1970s when they opened up the executive sessions to the public. This is, as I say, what most legislatures do. Just go back a sec. This is what most legislatures do. This is what happened, as I say, historically in the Massachusetts legislature, but it's become a fiction. The reality now is that after the public hearings, joint committees never meet again. Instead, at some later point in time, often many months after the public hearing, the committee members get an email from the chair or the chairs, laying out usually many, many bills, a list of many bills, 30, 40, 50 bills all at one time, that they are recommending action on. The bills, there's no explanation if there've been changes made to the bills in committee in the chair's hands. There's no explanation. There's no red line of any changes. So if you want to try to see what changes there have been from the original bill to what is being recommended by the chairs, you literally have to print them both out or put them both up on your screen and compare them line by line. And there's also very little time, usually a day, maybe 2 days, sometimes less, a few hours to vote on all of those bills. That's the reality of how committees now operate. And in the absence of any executive sessions, again, usually called a markup session, there's no meaningful opportunity for committee members to participate in shaping bills. There's no public accountability beyond an electronic poll of votes, again, as I said, taken with very little notice and usually with very little information. And in addition, without public markups and public votes, leadership has much greater leeway to shape the bills, both within the Joint Committee itself, because all the work is really being done, behind closed doors, through the chair, but usually with the direct participation of the Speaker's office or the Senate President's office. And also they have more leeway to shape the bills in subsequent committees, like the Ways and Means Committee, where most bills go after they come out of Joint Committee. The Ways and Means Committee also meets completely behind closed doors. So you have no idea who's involved in shaping the bill at that point, who they're talking to, who's come in to lobby one way or another. And the fact that in the Joint Committee, the rank and file members of the committee have not had an opportunity to publicly take a stand on the bill or aspects of the bill. Again, that just gives leadership, they're just much less constrained politically in how they decide to reshape the bill. So this is the reality of committee work, which again, in most legislatures is the absolute heart of the lawmaking process. So this brings us to the ballot reform, the stipend reform ballot question. So this is what we originally at the Coalition to Reform Our Legislature, and now in the form of a ballot committee, are hoping to bring to the statewide ballot in 2026. And it aims to do these three things. I should say, just because we're right in the, in the thick of collecting signatures, as you probably know, the way ballot questions work in Massachusetts, you have to do the first major round of signature gathering in the fall of the year before the year that you want to put a question on the ballot. I'm happy to report that we are very likely going to be successful in gathering the required signatures to get this question on the ballot next November. The deadline for gathering signatures is actually coming up the middle of next week. And we believe we have more than the 75,000 signatures that are needed. We've gathered them in more than 300 cities and towns around the state. So we're very optimistic that we're going to be able to move this ballot question forward. And it has these three main ways of addressing what I described earlier as these twin problems of excessive top-down control and weak bottom-up accountability. So first, it would limit the top-down control by reducing leadership's control over legislators' livelihoods. It would significantly cut the number and the size of the stipends under the Senate President and the Speaker's control. And it would raise pay for rank and file members who don't have stipends, particularly, as I said, on the House side. And then it would increase bottom-up accountability by conditioning the payment of leadership's own stipends on joint committees handling all bills in a democratic, transparent way through public markup sessions and public votes. And the beauty of stipend reform, is that it can address both of these sources of legislative dysfunction. It would address the dysfunction that the stipends themselves cause, that the excessive top-down control, and also use the reformed stipend system as leverage to address the dysfunctions of a closed, undemocratic, unaccountable lawmaking process. And the overall impact would be to promote a legislature that is more transparent, more productive, more responsive to the challenges we face, a legislature where our representatives are actually free to participate fully and actively and represent their districts openly, and where their constituents can see what they're doing to represent them and hold them accountable. So in sum, the idea is to promote a legislature that actually functions the way a representative democracy should. So finally, I just want to put up a slide here. You can get more information on the ballot question on these two websites. The first one, stipendreform.com, is the ballot question, the ballot committee website. The second one, the maledgereform.org, is the website of the Coalition to Reform Our Legislature, which is where the sort of background work was done leading up to this ballot question. There's a lot more information, details about the ballot question and the thinking that went into it on these two websites. So go there, and thank you very much. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Jonathan. Terrifying to realize how completely this process is controlled. A few questions. So here's one. Is it public knowledge who gets each of these stipends? Either one of you.
I can do quickly, and then other Jonathan tag in. That you know people's positions, right? So that you have all of this money goes with specific positions. You can see the position, but the legislature's website doesn't give like a clear accounting of like how much each person is individually paid. And feel free to tag in on more on that.
Yeah, I mean, the only place where you can actually see the dollars and cents as they're being paid out is on the comptroller's website. You can go there and look at the week or the biweekly payroll for legislators as well as other state employees, and you can sort of calculate backwards to figure out who's getting what stipends and how much. But as John said, it's public knowledge. And it's in a statute, which is why we can bring a ballot question to change it. There's a statute, Chapter 3, Section 9B of the Massachusetts General Laws, that sets out which positions get what size stipends. There's been an adjustment over time in the size of the stipends because of an indexing formula that's in that statute, which is actually growing them quite quickly. But you can, from there too, see which positions are getting stipends.
Yeah. So people have concerns about money. Jonathan Cohn, I don't know if you know, do you have any idea of how much money, roughly speaking, went into support for the working families agenda?
That's an excellent question that I don't know the answer to, but I do know that like any type of like large effort, and I can ask folks involved. Like I'm familiar with like the ballot question efforts that Raise Up has. There are like multi-million-dollar campaigns on the ballot. I can ask though, because I think that's a good question about how much went into that.
Right. And I think a lot of it came from unions, which
Yeah, I would think so. It could
really
be like the
invested
SEIUs, the
heavily.
teachers would have been the main funders of it.
Right. So here's a question for both of you. Um, for instance, progressive legislators, just not any by name, but just in general, how much pressure do they feel to remain in good relations with their colleagues in order to be able to get their legislation through? And so, quite apart from the dictatorial and leverage through stipends that the leadership has, how much does this need to be collegial with people who are collaborating with the leadership shape the way even progressives have to act? Otherwise, they're isolated completely. I'll start with you, Jonathan, heck, because you went through this, I believe.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, because the way the power dynamic works, it strains relationships among progressives. I'm sure John can speak to this as well, because there is a pressure from leadership for all legislators, including progressives, not to not to get too close to people who are perceived as being not falling in line. And over time, frankly it's a very dispiriting kind of dynamic, where you see colleagues who you not only ideologically aligned with, but who you have developed relationships with, pulling away, because they're worried that being seen as too close to someone who's not a team player, will jeopardize their ability to do what they need to do. Oftentimes, if they're from a district that is in need of resources, they have a lot of reason to want to make sure that they don't end up on the wrong side of the fence there. But it really eats away at the potential for solidarity among progressives in a way that I think is also a big factor in making it hard to move progressive priorities. John, do you?
Yeah, no, I think you said that really well. A few things that come to mind is one, I've often described this as somewhat of like a transitive nature of obedience to the speaker, that like you might not care yourself, but you care about what other people think who themselves care about what the speaker thinks. And if you progressive rap don't really like care that much there, but you care about the opinions that other progressive raps have about you and want to be able to want to collaborate them and want to be on their good side, and they're very mindful of being in the good graces of the speaker, that ends up kind of influencing you in almost like indirectly from that. You also have the ways, since the legislature really does operate as an incumbent protection racket, you have that discouragement of taking votes on anything or speaking out on anything, because anything that you do that puts your colleagues on the spot and might in any way dent what their constituents think about them is an attack on them and is frowned upon and damages and is kind of damaging to the social relations in the legislature. And so you have that kind of toxicity that comes there. I also think that uh, one of the best kind of signs of power is when you don't even need to wield it and it wields it's self-enforcing on everybody. And I often think about that in the state house, and especially even with like as kind of Jonathan noted with the stipend system, is you don't need to take it away from people that often to wield power, right? If people know that you can, and if it happens once and then suddenly people start falling in line and people start giving friendly advice to fall in line, and it's not ill-motivated per se if a legislator is telling another one that you can't do this because none of your bills are going to pass. That might be entirely good faith. It's just a terribly a terrible set of like perverse incentives in the system that would lead to that being seen as good advice that then becomes like short-term rational, long-term foolish with a number of these systems where they can make sense for any of how you're operating in the system, but by entrenching that system itself, weakens your ability to get more out of it that you could only with the system working otherwise.
So, thank you. So, Jonathan Heck, just to be clear, do you believe that changing the stipend process is going to be sufficient to turn everything around, or do you see it as one contribution and that there'll have to be other guardrails? And a related question, will there have to be a change in who actually sits in both houses?
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's no, no one silver bullet. I do think that this would be an institutional change that would bring a cultural change at a very, very significant level. I don't think there's ever been an effort made. I mean, I was involved in a lot of efforts to change rules within the legislature, and it's quite clear that that's never going to happen. And I think a good part of the reason why it's never going to happen is what we're talking about here, is the stipend system and all that it undergirds. So I think this is an absolutely essential, necessary part of the change. And I think that it will bring in its train a different environment to work that will, in turn, I think, demand a different set of, it will demand different things from legislators. I mean, if, for instance, every bill has a markup session and a public vote in committee, committee members are going to feel a strong obligation, and many of them will see it as a great opportunity because I think many of them would like to be more actively involved, but they're going to feel a strong obligation to be actively and visibly engaged in shaping legislation at the committee level. And that, as I said, will have a knock-on effect in terms of the amount of leeway that leadership has to shape the system, shape legislation, both there in the committees and subsequently in places like Ways and Means. Because when many more representatives or senators are on the record in front of their constituents, in front of the press, in front of the advocates saying, this is what I like about this bill, this is what I don't like about this bill, it's just going to make much harder to then reshape it behind closed doors. And I think it's also going to demand a different set of skills from chairs. I mean, frankly, chairs these days, their one obligation is to be responsive to and listen to what the people above them say. But if they have to actually bring together a majority of vote in support of a piece of legislation, they're going to have to actually do the hard work of legislating, that we think of as how democracy works, where there's going to be much more listening, much more give and take, much more allowing more participation and engagement by other voices and the full range of stakeholders, as opposed to just those who happen to have access to the chair or to the speakers because they're powerful, they have money. I think it'll diminish the power of lobbyists. I think it'll have a whole series of kind of knock-on effects. And I don't, I'm not naive. I think as maybe John said earlier in his presentation, there will be a response from the legislature and from the leadership. They will try to find new ways to maintain their control. But if instead of controlling significant amounts of pay for 94 members of the Democratic caucus, you'll only be able to do that with 30 members of the caucus, which is what the stipend reform ballot question would do. It's going to be a very different picture. And again, adding to that, the fact that there's going to be a different style of lawmaking that's going to be much more open, much more accountable, much more participatory. I think it's going to make a very, very significant difference.
One thing I want to tag in there that I think speaks to Henry's question as well is if you want to get good people to run for office, so often you face the problem is they get burnt out very quickly because the system is not designed for people who want to legislate in the state house. And because we need to make the legislature function better, but also need better people to be in the better functioning legislature. And I think that those two feed off of each other because the system as it is now is when you elect somebody better, you have what I often call a quicksand effect of them getting like deeper and deeper into the system and then people start doing what I like to call legisplaining, right? That insular way of speaking about how, oh no, you constituents, you don't actually know how things are. This is just the way the legislature works and why we need to do this thing that you might think is actually terrible. But we know better than you, right? And what this is about by changing some of the functionings of the legislature can make that work of retention. It can also make the job more attractive to people. If you believe that you as a rank and file member can do more, it can also help make it so that the job seems more attractive to better candidates. And I was also thinking of this in terms of the way that kind of procedural changes can also influence opportunities for organizing. I was thinking about what's been happening this week with the House trying to advance a really terrible, honestly, energy bill that's basically written by a bunch of corporate lobbyists as their wish list and rolling back our clean energy commitments and climate commitments in the state. That it is helpful that we know how people voted in committee on that, right? It still got through, but it can help influence the advocacy as kind of we try to make sure that that bill doesn't pass on the floor or gets radically rewritten before it does, because you can see then on the committee who are your allies, who started off as allies and got like browbeaten by the chair into submission and then flipped on you, who stayed with you, and then what does that mean for as you try to build and kind of build a broader coalition in the legislature?
Jonathan, I think we're going to have to pull this
Yeah.
together now. Thanks to both of you for an insightful and fascinating and terrifying story, but it helps to explain why we're in the situation that we're in and the tasks that are before us. I mean, we saw what working families did, and the question is, could we do something better than that that proves to be more resistant? Aaron, can we go to the next slide, please? Okay. The very last. There should be one more. No. Keep going. No. All right. Never mind. I just wanted to tell people that this was all the work not only of the two Jonathans, but behind the scenes, Aaron Singer, Llewellyn, who proposed this forum, and many people who've been working with Platform in Action, which is dedicated to making a change in all of this. And we'd love to have more people participate. And you can get back to any of us, write to platforminaction@gmail.org and provide your comments about this forum. Let us know which additional subjects you would like to see be used as the impetus for a forum. For instance, here's one: why have so many people left the Democratic Party? And that might be informative. In any case, Again, thanks to our two speakers, and thanks to all of you for making this so worthwhile. Good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks again for hosting. That was a lot of fun.